I was a kid, my parents would be like, don't just read comics, they try to sneak my comics away from me and slip in, Willa Cather or something. and with Charlie, I'm like, oh, I left the Peanuts volume on your bed, and all that, it's like, or I'd be mad, like, why didn't you read the rest of that Superboy comic I put on your,
What's wrong with you? Yeah. You can't read this Dickens until you finish the Superboy comic.
Yeah, you're always reading this, high-handed literature. You've got to read these comic books I put out for you. You'll never understand modern civilization. He's sort of at the stage where now maybe he could start reading, like, my stuff. Like, he's never read any of my comics or, like more adult kind of stuff. But he liked Little Lulu. That was the one thing that really, like, he read every single one, and he would use the words the characters use, like these antiquated terms. Like, I remember once when he was little and he got really sad, and he actually went, "Baw," because that's how they
the onomatopoeia of crying. Yeah,
right. My wife and I just like literally collapsed on the floor, like sobbing, like, "Oh my God!" He just said "baw."
The collection. I mean, it sounds like you played a pretty big role in putting it together. I mean, you actually
in the original art book.
Yeah, you went through and chose the pieces yourself. Is that right?
Well, it was mostly like I just had all the scans and I had the original, so I hired a helper to come in and scan all the pages, but I was sort of having to go through it as we were putting it together, so it was not like I went out of my way to work on it. It was just like I was the conduit for how Fantagraphics got all the artwork. So
does it feel weird to do a collection like that? I mean, obviously this isn't the first retrospective of your stuff. I mean, does it feel like eulogizing yourself to some degree?
Well, it's more like you're looking at the artwork as artwork, which is very different than like I tried not to pick stuff necessarily for like historical value. I tried to actually pick pages that I thought were interesting or that were different from the other pages, or that I didn't want it to be like the same page over and over and over, which a lot of the original art books I feel like it's like you just need one page and you kind of get it, yeah. And I wanted it to be all over the map from all phases of my career, and pages that maybe there were a few that other people were like, why'd you pick that one? And it was just something that I happened to like for whatever reason visually.
As a whole, it's pretty representative of your work? Yeah,
I feel pretty good about it because luckily my old friend Alvin Buenaventura, may he rest in peace, he had the thought of that one day this book would exist, and it might have even been before there were any of these original art books, but he really had this idea of like, if you want to sell any of your work or move it anywhere else, you have to scan it at the highest possible resolution so that it could be reprinted as original art. And I remember thinking, like, what a waste of time. I don't want to deal with that. And he went through and did all that for all my early artwork. And so without him, this book would have been a third of its size.
When you go back and look at the old stuff, does it make you nostalgic for the early work? Are you prone to nostalgia?
Not for my own work, no. It's funny, it all just comes back. You look at the pages and I can literally remember what I was listening to on the radio during certain panels. It's just like a mnemonic device, and that's not true of looking at the printed pages. That's a very different thing. But to look at the actual originals it has a real power. It represents a week in your life at some point, and you really can feel like, here's what I was doing for an entire week. There's not many other experiences like that where you can feel just the hours of sitting in this one position, looking at this one thing, focusing.
It is something that is something interesting about the process of mass producing it is that you remove all of the lines, you remove all of the work, you remove all of the hours that it took to produce every single panel. It almost hides the work that you've done to some degree.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing because it really is. The original art is not the art. It's a byproduct of the art. I always liken it to like a abandoned hornet's nest or something like that. It's like this individually potentially beautiful thing that's created after the actual function has flown away. So it's just this reminder of something else. But so with the book, I tried to pick those pages that worked on their own, that you could maybe look at for longer than it would take to just read the page, that there might be something more to them.
To me, the most interesting part of the book actually comes at the end, where you break down the old processes, the kind of arcane processes that you totally spend most of your life working on. Why was it important to include that?
I mean, I did it with a sort of ironic tone, but I want people, especially anybody under 40, 45, would look at some of these techniques and just think like, what are you doing? Why would you do it like this? But it was all mostly pre-digital. And so it was, we used one of the things I used early on was called Zipatone. That was this archaic thing, mostly popular in the 50s, most famously used by people like Wally Wood and EC Comics and things like that. That was a dot pattern that came on a transparent sticker, and you would cut it out and adhere it to your artwork, and it basically made gray tones by taking little black dots that could be printed without sort of modern printing techniques that would involve scanning and turning artwork into color artwork. It's for printing only in black and white. And so it's this very mechanical process. People really look down on it, but I love how it looked. I loved the patterns it created.
People look down on the final product?
Well, they would look down on the use of Zipatone. It was sort of like, well, why don't you do cross-hatching or ink wash or any of these other techniques that are more sort of artistic in the way of, how they are prepared. But Zipatone was sort of a mechanical thing that was thought of as something used by more, technicians than artists.
It's almost like a cheat in a way?
Yeah. I remember my grandma, I guess, saw me using Zipatone once, and she was like, if you were a real artist, you would map those out and draw the dots on. And it's like, nobody could do that. Like, even like Liechtenstein can't pull it off at 500 times the size. And I remember, just thinking like, you don't get it, Mom.
That's such a hyper-specific criticism, too. Yeah. Was she an artist at all, or was she just a believer in hard work?
Yeah, she just thought I was lazy. And to a degree, she was correct. When I was in high school, I first got some Zipatone, and I realized how it could make a terrible high school kid's drawing look really cool. Look like you show it to your friends, and they're like, whoa, that looks awesome, because they're just looking at the dots, and their brain is fooled into not noticing how terrible the actual drawing is.
So you were taking this, it sounds like, pretty seriously at that point in high school, if you're already exploring the world of Zipatone.
I think I first saw like EC Comics probably when I was about, 13 or 14. And I was like, what are those dots that Wally Wood is using? And I would see a lot of early comic fanzines and things like that. And a lot of fan artists would use Zipatone because everything was printed in black and white. And so it was something you just sort of find out about by word of mouth. It was very hard to find out about art supplies back then. You had to really kind of guess and just experiment and try to just figure it out on your own.
It struck you at that point that was something that you could do professionally?
Well, that was the dream. I don't know how realistic I was. I would have, when I was 13 or 14, I would have thought I might have wanted to do comics that were more interesting to me. Like I really liked, horror comics and I liked, like the DC comics where it was not about superheroes, where it was like just about Jimmy Olsen or Lois Lane, or I liked romance comics a lot, but I knew I would have to do superhero comics at that time. So I used to sort of try to force myself to get into it. And I just, more and more, I was not interested in at least the superhero comics of that era. The late 70s, which was like the lowest point in comics history for all comics.
Did your impression of them change when superhero comics, I suppose, got more interesting, at least when, Frank Miller kind of came in?
It's only gotten worse.
You think it's been downhill since then?
I've never been interested since, Kurt Swan stopped drawing Superman.
Yeah.
I can't even think what the last superhero comic I actually sat down and finished was.
You went to art school, though?
Yeah.
With an eye on comics?
Yeah. Yeah, that was my goal. Originally, I wanted that. Back then, there was only one school that taught comics, and it was the Joe Kubert School that I only knew about because there were ads, I think, in like the Overstreet Comics price guide.
It does have kind of a mail away kind of
totally
vibe to it.
And I remember telling my parents, like, I want to go to the Joe Kubert School. And my dad was really fixated on me going to like a Ivy League school and was like, what do you know, and he'd always use Gary Trudeau it's like Gary Trudeau went to Yale and then he became a cartoonist, but he learned all this. And
so he was okay with you becoming a cartoonist if you did it on his terms.
If I did it via, getting a political science degree or something. And I just had zero interest. I really just wanted to learn how to do comics. So as a compromise, I went to Pratt in Brooklyn, which there was almost nothing there that had to do with comics, but I got to meet a lot of people who were into comics. And that was sort of the education I got, was by hanging out with friends who shared the same passion that I did.
I got the feeling, looking at some interviews you had done, that when like Raw came along, for example, that it was inaccessible, but for different reasons.
When Raw first came out, I felt like that everything had shifted. I felt like this is like what we've all been saying, that comics can be, for a whole different audience. Those were, living in New York at the time, you saw those were sold in art galleries and at fancy bookstores and stuff like that, and where you would never imagine a copy of Marvel 2-in-1 or whatever, and so it was it felt like it was this whole different market had opened up. But I was also just super jealous of it because I knew I wasn't old enough, I wasn't good enough at all to be in Raw, and I knew like this is what I want to do, but it feels totally off limits to me and a slightly different sensibility than I had.
Did you get the sense that it was kind of a cool kids club? It
felt like it because I didn't know any of the people in it. Once I met everybody, I saw that we were all of a similar type, but at the time they all seemed very distant to me.
Were you ever able to impress your parents with your work? Was there ever a point when you were able to sort of point to something and to show them and they could actually, really be proud of, at least understand?
My mom has always been sort of vaguely supportive, but also not interested.
Yeah.
It's like she was thwarted a lot by my grandparents as a kid. So she's very mindful of like never doing that to me, but it's also, she's not interested in comics at all. So it's a semi-hollow support, but and my dad was not into. I remember as a kid telling my grandma I wanted to be a professional cartoonist, and she told that to my dad, like, "Isn't it wonderful? He wants to be a professional cartoonist." And I remember so distinctly my dad going, like, "God, I hope not." It really haunted me for you. But he once I made a movie, he was very into it. He became like my biggest fan after that, to the point that he would embarrass me by like writing letters to Roger Ebert bragging about me, and like literally like to all the local Chicago movie critics, and he would send them my early drawings and stuff, and would meet these guys like at Sundance or something, and they would be like, your dad writes to me all the time, and I was just, oh my God, so mortifying.
There really isn't a broader society context for success in comics. You could be at the top of and you have been at the top of your game for, a while now, but I assume parents in the PTA probably don't, it doesn't really register with them.
No. He'd be very picky about anything I would say in an interview, like especially if it was about my family or something. He was like, that's not true at all, and he'd take great umbrage to it, but yeah, he actually read my comics after that and sort of begrudgingly admitted he liked them.
At what point for you was it clear that you were on the right path? You were.
I'm not sure I am at that point yet.
At what point was it? Okay, let me rephrase that. At what point was it clear that you could make a career of doing this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I never had huge expectations for what that would mean. I just, it's one of those jobs that's, you have to live by your wits a lot and sort of figure out, okay, this year I'm going to do this. And I've made a living doing various different things within the world of comics. First I did a lot of illustration stuff, and then I worked for movies and did that sort of as a way to make extra money, and then selling artwork seems to be the way that I've sort of settled into as the sort of main source of income.
It is interesting that the comics themselves ultimately are kind of like loss leaders. That again,
it's almost like a catalog for original art or something.
That relates, I think, back to the idea of the artifact, but the actual product is the artifact.
Yeah. I mean, I shouldn't say that necessarily, because at a certain point you get enough editions in foreign countries, and like you can build up where you just have always something in print and things. You get, I get random checks from Portugal for an edition of Like a Velvet Glove that I didn't even know about, things like that. So it's the more you have, the longer you do it, the more there is sort of circulating out there. But it's very hard to do it just by sales unless you have some huge hit one after the other.
It's incredibly depressing to hear you say that as somebody who, like, you are like the person for a lot of people, again, top of your game. You're a lot of people's idea of sort of success, and the comics in and of themselves are not really enough. It's
also the way I do it. I mean, yeah. I don't, if I really forced myself, I could do them. I could crank them out much more quickly, and I just wouldn't be happy with them. I wouldn't feel 100%. Probably nobody else could tell the difference, but to me it would be all important to take, an extra 2 or 3 years sometimes to do a book. Sometimes I'll spend a year writing it and then throw the whole thing away and do something else.
How many of those are there? How many books have you just tossed out?
In the writing stage, many. 7 or 8.
Have you started the process of drawing and given up?
The only one I ever did that with extensively is the one that's reprinted in the original art book, which was sort of a sequel to Ice Haven that was all set in Los Angeles. And I had it all kind of figured out. I was doing all this like real drawing, like photo reference drawing, and going to LA and taking pictures and trying to get these real locations. And then and I just realized I just really don't like LA at all. And I thought, like, do I want to spend 4 years like basically spending my day in LA in parts that I sort of actively don't like? It wasn't about the parts of LA that I do like. It was about all about the sort of Hollywood corporate parts that I don't like at all. So I just couldn't do it. I just thought, like, I gotta get out of this world. It was.
You don't mean spending time there physically?
I mean spending time there mentally, in my artistic world that I, live in 8 hours a day. I just, after a while, I would get up in the morning and I'd be like, is there anything else I can do besides work on this comic? And so after I did, I think 7 pages, I was like, okay, I'm going to move on to something else.
It's that all encompassing that it will just completely throw the rest of your life out of whack.
Yeah. I mean, you've gotta, sort of have a reason to go in there every morning and want to get into the world, that you're trapped yourself in. It's like you got to give yourself a nice prison cell to spend time in. And LA was not the one I wanted to be in. Maybe one day I'll get older and it'll be more interesting, but it's just, it never clicked for me to get back into it. And once you're out of it, usually it's impossible to get back in.
Have you had that experience with a book before that it was just completely emotionally taxing in that way? Something that you completed?
I mean, I try to make them all sort of emotionally intense, where I have to go through the process that the character's going through to some degree, and to keep an openness that I don't exactly know, what's happening. I'm sort of going through it blindly a little bit as the character is. But this felt like I had this sort of agenda in mind, and I was sort of setting out to fill in the details. It didn't feel like it felt a little too, pre-scripted in a way that I knew what I was going to have to draw. I could see 50 pages ahead, and I knew I was going to be drawing, a detailed view of the Santa Monica Pier or something. And I just thought, like, oh man, I don't want to do that.
Santa Monica Pier is not a bad place to be.
It's not a bad place to be physically, yeah. But just to have to be stuck with the absolute reality of that. Like, a lot of my work is sort of in a disguised version of a city I know well. It's often Oakland or Chicago or New York, but I'm not being so specific about it that I have to get all the details right. And I find that is a lot more freeing. Then you can kind of go with whatever the whim of that particular day is and change things slightly. And it's almost like a dream version of the world, which is what I'm much more interested in than the photographed version of the world.
It's a combination, I guess, of the fact that Los Angeles is such an industry town that everything is so tied to the movie making process, but also you kind of painted yourself into a corner by doing all of that due diligence, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it was sort of an experiment. I thought, I've never really done that where I had like reference for every single background, and it was not at all made up. It's all, based on either sketching or photographs of things that I'm, adapting. And I thought maybe that would be a really interesting way to work for once, and it just didn't fit me at all.
Was the first and last time that you're going to do that, probably?
And I could do it, but it would have to be a place I really want to be, which probably would be something more visually interesting than LA. I found LA really visually repulsive.
I'm not going to argue with you.
It just doesn't have there's parts of it that are really beautiful. I like downtown LA, or at least the way it used to be before it became all cool. High rises. Yeah.
How far do you ultimately deviate from the script? I mean, it sounds like you're pre-writing quite a bit of it, but then you're just letting the story kind of go its own way?
Yeah, I usually have to have like a skeleton for at least each part of the story and a solid idea for the whole thing, but I try to keep it open and adapt along the way and not feel constricted and feel like I can add 5 pages in the middle of a story if I have to, or very often I'm cutting stuff. I try to be ruthless about cutting everything, and there's Alex Toth has some line about, it's better to just cut everything beforehand. You don't waste any time. It's all
just never write the book in the first place. And
you do a lot of thinking and I try to live mentally in the world for a very long time before I start. So I have all these details that I know. I write down endless long variations of the stories and where they go off on tangents that I'm not going to ever draw, but I know that's part of the story, and then you're informed by that. Then when you're done, it feels like you're drawing the real world where there are other implied stories around the edges that aren't there. Too many stories feel like they wrote exactly what they have in the book, and there's nothing beyond that. The characters have no life beyond that. You can't imagine them living their normal lives.
You're writing your own fan fiction, it sounds like.
Basically.
The Abandoned Book having been a sort of sequel to Ice Haven, but beyond that, and I guess obviously beyond some of the 8-ball stuff with reoccurring characters, that there hasn't been enough in one of the stories to want to kind of come back to it at some point.
I mean, that's sort of the idea. I admire like the Hernandez brothers or people like that who can just stick with the same characters and turn any idea they have into a Hopi story. That's a way to do it for sure. But I'm always like, I get dissatisfied with like the style I'm using, the characters I'm using, and I just want to start over. And to me, that new start is always the best time. And I feel like if I just had to go back to the same characters over and over, I would never get that feeling. And I'm sure for other artists they get that feeling just starting a new story with the same characters, and there's a certain ease and familiarity they have.
I have to imagine that 8-ball would have scratched that itch really well, both in terms of it being short stories and aesthetically varying quite a bit from story to story.
Yeah, that was the idea. I mean, I could so easily imagine myself getting bored being stuck just drawing the same character over and over. I mean, my first comic, Lloyd Llewellyn, was not necessarily what I wanted to do. It was sort of, back when I started that, it was sort of agreed that that's the way to do a successful black and white comic, is you have to have like a main character and do stories with that character. And I tried to do all kinds of different stories with the character, but I got really bored having to shoehorn him into everything. And it was such a great freeing relief to do 8-ball where I could just do 2 pages of anything I wanted. And in fact, had to do 2 pages because I'd have 29 pages sort of committed to in an issue, and then I'd realize I had 3 more pages to fill with like a week to go, and I would just, okay, I got to make something up, and that was really fun. very challenging.
I always got the feeling reading Velvet Glove that was probably for you the ultimate experience of just seeing where the story would take itself.
Yeah.
Did you set out with anything in mind when you sat down to write that?
I wasn't even sure there was going to be a second chapter.
Yeah.
I did the first chapter just to throw myself into something, literally paint myself into a corner.
So part of the creation process for you is setting out not only parameters, but like obstacles?
Kind of, yeah. And the way, that I always thought of myself as like walking on a tightrope with that whole story. And then all of a sudden, you're at the end and you're like, what do I do now? What do I do for the last 5 feet? And by the end of that story, I had lived in that world so intensely, and so it was so sort of deeply felt that it all made sense to me. But I knew as I was doing the last couple chapters, like, that it was going to take people, many decades of trying to figure it out to make any sense of it.
Can you make sense of it?
I'm not sure I could anymore if I reread it.
It made sense to you at the time.
It absolutely did, yeah.
Has anyone gone back to you with an idea and explained it to you in a way that, has anyone figured it out, I guess is the way of putting it?
Yeah, sure. There is no figuring it out. It doesn't have like an algebraic, solution
Sure.
or anything. But there are people who have read it in much the same way I was seeing it.
When you inhabit something so fully to a point where it's really impacting your mood and your life beyond that, have you worked yourself into a depression doing your work?
No, my work is the opposite of depression. Yeah. No, I'm depressed about everything else. If I feel depressed about my work, I'd do something else. See, it's okay. And she's like, oh, those guys.
You had a book derailed by Trump?
Oh, no, not necessarily. It was more that the book I'm actually working on now.
So you're back at it.
Yeah, I never stopped. It was just the book when I first was thinking of it. It was probably early 2016 when I was thinking of it, and I remember
those days. Remember those carefree days.
Yeah, and it just felt like. And I didn't think of this consciously, but just in the back of my mind, it was like, well, this is going to, we're going to have 4 years of Hillary Clinton. It just felt like that's what the next 4 years is going to be. And I didn't consciously set out to write a book about that at all. But the minute Trump was elected, I knew this story is going to be very deeply affected by what just happened. I knew that living through that daily reality, which is so much more insane than I ever imagined. I think all of us.
Did you see this Sharpie thing the other day?
Oh yeah.
I was having a conversation with a friend about it last night, and he said something like, no, this is the most ridiculous thing. And I was like, no, you don't understand. There's a most ridiculous thing every week, and we just...
Although there's something about this that I find very interesting, which is that it's a visual lie, which is really rare. It's one thing to tell a verbal
when
lie.
There's physical evidence of the crime.
Yeah, or just to see it. You hear words from a conman like Trump, and you could convince yourself, if you're his supporter, that, oh, he doesn't mean that. He's using this for different reasons to get at the liberals who hate, or whatever it is that's sort of outside the actual words he says. But this is to see it as a visual, as a cartoon basically. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to rebut it somehow. It feels much more damning in a way.
I think what was so bold about it, figuratively and literally, was the fact that it wasn't. He didn't attempt to make it look like...
That's what's so great about it.
I suspect you probably don't really want to talk about the upcoming work that much.
Yeah, I'm not quite ready to...
Yeah, but can you kind of pinpoint for me what it was about that the work that didn't, at least at first, make sense under a Trump presidency?
Oh, more like... Well, say, okay, take, for example, I did that comic, The Death Ray. Mm-hmm. That started out as, sort of what it was, sort of a teenage version of one of my friends getting superpowers. And I was working on that during the Iraq War, after 9/11 and when, Cheney and everybody was getting us involved in that. And so it's very informed by that, but not in a way that I was aware of when I was doing it. You know, it was just that's what I was listening to on the radio every day and talking about with my wife and all.
Can you, now that you're removed from it, can you kind of pinpoint those connections?
It's a subtle thing. It's not a.
Yeah.
I never do anything that's like overtly political. It's all just what informs the tone of the piece, and I could just tell that this book would be informed by that, just because everything's informed by what's sort of the main things running through my head at the time of working on it. I mean, that's sort of the process.
So it wasn't specific to the story?
Not at all.
You could have been working on any book.
Could have been working on any book. I knew that this book had sort of an opening for that type of stuff more than others might have.
I mean, it sounds like you had to back away for a little bit and regroup.
No, I mean, I think there was whatever the article was where I
Sure.
said all this was just, as with most articles, somebody wrote a cute headline that made it seem like I was totally abandoning something because of Trump, and I was probably joking, as I usually am, and jokes don't work anymore.
We need a new form
of like, I've always had this sort of sarcasm that's right on the edge of actually being serious, but is not necessarily. And that tone is gone. That tone does not exist anymore.
You do have to, I mean, you have to rethink it, right? Or do you have to wait for things to sort of play out? Do you have to see what the world is going to look like over the next couple of years?
No, because as I say, I'm not like conceiving of something in its entirety in advance. You know, I had very sort of loose ideas for the beats of this book. I mean, this book is made up of a bunch of standalone-ish short stories that all then tie together. But I wasn't at the point of writing where I had to all of a sudden go like, oh my gosh, this is going to go in a totally different direction than I had imagined. I just knew that the way I sort of, in some very intangible way, conceived it would go was going to be derailed along the way, because I was going to be going through some external experience that's much more unpredictable than I imagined.
Did it slow the process down at all?
Well, Trump slows the process down for sure.
So you have to like pencil in 3 hours of crying every morning.
It's more just the sort of, like, I really had to rethink how I felt about human nature, and just I guess I had a higher opinion of sort of human skepticism or something.
Which is funny to hear. Like you said, you're a sarcastic person. That certainly comes off in a lot of the work.
But you almost can't do that anymore. I mean, it sort of felt like that was safe during a time where I thought that the bulk of the world was rational. And to see the sort of willful avoidance of obvious reality, and to me just more to not sort of see what a classic American con man, to grow up and to not be able to process like, oh, this guy is not reputable. This guy has all the qualities of a con man from like a Herman Melville story. I mean, it's like a time-honored trope. Every single aspect of it is so obvious that it's just deeply troubling that people would sort of want to believe in that.
Do you think that up to that point, up till that like very rude reckoning, that you had become less cynical as you had gotten older?
I think all my cynicism was warranted.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it all sort of comes flooding back. But that tends to happen to be, especially
Sure.
like, you get married, you have a kid, you get older. Like for a lot of people, the cynicism is
Right.
left behind.
I guess it seemed sort of like the lies and the sort of the trickery that you would see from George Bush Sr. or somebody like that. That felt much more sort of subtle and not as not so overt. And then to see it in such a crude, overt form still work was jarring.
When you go back and do something like this book or any other instances where there's been a retrospective and you're able to kind of connect with that moment in time, does it feel like the work of a different person?
Yeah, it always does. I don't even when I look at my work from 20 or 30 years ago. It seems like a totally different person.
I mean, are you embarrassed by any of it looking back?
No, not at all.
No.
Not at all. I like it all. It's actually, the more distant it is, the more I like it, because I'm sort of more forgiving of this person that I barely connect to anymore.
It's that sort of 5 or 10 year rule of if you're looking back at something immediately, the first thing you see is all the mistakes, but once it's far enough in the past, you're able to appreciate it through a different lens.
I mean, it's sort of like if it's recent, I still could maybe correct it. It's like even
the George Lucas.
Yeah. That's a real danger. That if I look at something as recent as Patience, for example, I could look at that and I could say, oh, I should redraw this face, and I could really add a page here and do this and that, whatever. And that still seems like, well, that's still a possibility. But if I look at like Velvet Glove or something like that, it's just indelible at this point. That's what it is. There's no changing it.
I think that's part of the danger you run into with sequels too. A sequel, in a sense, is a way of kind of going back and correcting things, or going back and changing things.
Yeah. I've never had much interest in sequels, both as a viewer or as a writer. I really like standalone things that are, get in and out, and that's it.
Do you have trouble finishing, or once you're done with the work, are you done? It's out the door.
Usually, by the time I'm done, I'm ready to be done.
So those feelings of like wanting to go back and correct every piece of somebody's face, that's something that like comes after the process of having expunged this.
It's funny. There's a certain process that I go through that's probably similar for a lot of artists, where like right after I'm done and I look at what I've done, it seems terrible.
Yeah.
Like it always seems like I just see the crudeness. Like to me, it just seems like the work of a toddler or something. It just seems so crude and just not what I intended at all. Like just way below what I have envisioned. And then I'll put it away, I'll send it off to the printer. I never look at it really when it comes out, and I'll not think about it. And like a year later, I'll look at the originals again, and they'll look really slick and like, wow, these are like professional looking. It's a totally different feeling, and it's really interesting.
I think about this a lot. I think about something a friend told me a lot. She was talking about having a baby, and the baby was really ugly when it was born.
They all are.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe it took a little bit longer for the baby to get cute. Yeah. She was very concerned about the fact that it would never become cute. And like, I think that's a really good metaphor for like working on a piece of art for really long.
Totally. Yeah, our son was horrific when he was born.
Has your approach to putting ink on paper changed to such a degree that it's... I mean, obviously, it's clear to me as somebody who looks at your work once it's, produced the way it's meant to be produced commercially, that this is the work of the same artist. But do the sort of the ingredients look a lot different when you go back and re-examine them?
Well, I know early on I was much more self-conscious and nervous about the way the art looked. I've never been really self-conscious about the writing or the stories that much, but I really, really wanted the art to have this certain level of professionalism that I was very concerned with as a young artist. And so I can see that a lot of, like, I would use French curves to make the lines, and you could just see the stiffness in my drawing. Like I could almost feel like just the strain of my hand. I can just, when I look at some of those, especially like Velvet Glove pages, I just picture my hand with like veins popping out of the back. It just feels like so tense. And now everything is much, much less tense. Like I feel like I know what I'm doing.
This is something I think a lot about as it sort of pertains to my own life. And I think this is part of growing up and getting older, is recognizing that the things that you continue to do for completely arbitrary reasons.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Drawing comics really is all about that. There's a lot of things where I think, you learn, it's a very specific little world, but you think like, oh, I only learned to draw ears at this point, and it's only been 3 or 4 years that I knew how to draw an ear correctly.
Yeah.
This is a total example. And
then the Rob Liefeld syndrome is.
but you think of the like, oh, now I can draw ears, and then you'll look back and you'll realize like, oh, it's been 25 years that I've been doing this version of ears.
Yeah.
But it's just it feels like you just figured it out, things I think I've never done before, I'll look back in old comics and, oh, wow, I did this exact panel.
And not specific to comics, but is especially prevalent in comics, is the key to unlocking it is like finding the right shortcut, right? Finding the right 2 or 3 lines that equate to that real world object.
I find I'm using more and more lines. I find that as the world gets more cartoonish, I'm making my comics more specific. Like I'm drawing more, I'm trying to make the characters all look very real and specific and not at all that, that kind of Scott McCloud thing where you give almost no detail so that the reader can project themselves onto the character. I always feel like I have my own stable of actors and they all, it's like, here's the woman who played Patience, and when she was younger, she was Rebecca in Ghost World, and now she's the main character of my new book.
Years ago in college, I had a friend who went to maybe Ape, or some comic show in Northern California, and met you, and I was like, oh, what does he look like? Because at the time, at least, like, it was like your own drawings.
You had to go by the drawing.
Yeah, but he said, well, he looks like a Dan Clowes drawing. Which I thought was like the best possible response. He looks like
I think a lot of people look like they're drawing. You can sort of tell. I remember once walking down the street in Berkeley, and I saw this guy coming at me, and I was like, this guy has just got to be a cartoonist. I just had this feeling. And then he, as he came up, he introduced himself as Jason, the cartoon, and it was like he had just been in town for some signing, but he just had such a vibe of like that guy looks like a cartoonist, and it was just something I can't put it into words, but
yeah, I mean, other than Seth, who dresses like a cartoon character.
Seth is easy to spot.
I don't know how much of this is like cosmic coincidences. This idea of the world getting more cartoony and your work getting more realistic. I mean, that's something that, like, it seems has kind of occurred to you with some distance. It's not something you're consciously doing, is it?
In a way, I mean, I think I'm drawn to doing it that way more and more. Once I became aware of it, when you become aware of the things you're doing, you can either go, oops, and move away from that, or you can go, you know what, that's the right way to go. And I don't know, I was, again, back to Trump for the millionth time, but I feel like nobody has done a good cartoon of Trump. Like, it's just impossible, because what can you do? Nobody could do a funnier cartoon than Trump drawing on a map with a Sharpie. Like, there's literally nothing.
That's the problem everybody talks about in comedy is right. It's almost too easy.
Yeah.
But also aesthetically, too.
Right.
You can't really draw a grotesque caricature of the guy.
And it is insufficient to the task. And whenever I see somebody doing a political cartoon where they try to draw him, it just seems it's got like a level of obscenity to it almost, where it just falls so short of what is needed. And actually, the only drawing I've ever seen of Trump that really hit me that was right was in Drew Friedman's new book of presidents. He drew every single U.S. president in order, and you're sort of going through the book, and he gets everybody just beautifully. But when you get to that punchline that is the last page, and you see Trump, it's just he got it, and it's the only drawing you see where like that captures everything about him.
I think the one cartoonist who has done it right, I can't think of his name, but he's the conservative cartoonist who draws Trump as like super handsome.
Yeah, I think that guy's much more interesting than any guy coming from the left.
I think because he's like the cartoonist of our age in a weird way.
Or the guy who does those paintings.
The paintings, yeah, Nick McNaughton, I think
Nick
is his
McNaughton,
name.
Yeah. Those have such a transgressive power to them, because they're just so, they fill you with such a horrible feeling, but it's not what you normally get from political art.
Earlier in the conversation, you described movies as almost, it sounded like kind of a side hustle at the time, or at least when you first got into it.
That's how I thought of it.
And you did refer to it in the past tense. I mean, Wilson isn't that long ago. Obviously, that was
Right.
different than the Zweigoff stuff. Does it feel past tense to you? Does it feel like something that you're just not involved in?
I mean, there are like options on several books, and there's projects, discussed all the time, but I just don't want to work on it. I at a certain point, I felt like for a while, I really enjoyed writing the screenplays, and it was very freeing, because compared to doing comics, it's a very different thing. Like first of all, you write screenplays, and the only people who read it are hyper interested readers who are going to read every word and analyze every page, and you don't have anybody else you're appealing to except for this tiny little group of people. And I found that was very satisfying, to have people read stuff so carefully.
That would terrify me. The idea of somebody reading it at that detail, that sounds miserable. But you enjoyed that.
No, I liked it because nobody reads comics like that. You never get any feedback like that in comics.
You want it to feel like somebody is taking the time that it took to do it.
Yeah, it was just a fun, and you're not thinking about a mass audience. You're thinking about, one or two people, usually just a director. And it was just so fascinating. And then they would say, like, get rid of this character and change this person's name and do that, and it's so easy to do that. You can just press cut and paste, and all of a sudden everything, moves around, and it's just so fluid to write a script like that. Whereas in a comic, if you get halfway through and you go like, oh man, this character should have been an old lady. Too bad, unless you want to redraw it every time it appeared in the story.
Yeah, I guess it's liberating from the standpoint of not being maybe emotionally invested in quite the same way.
Right. And that was the thing. It wasn't like, this wasn't going into my lasting legacy or whatever. My comics, I feel like this is what I've done. These are my babies that I'm 100% responsible for. You don't feel that like a Ghost World or any of those are a part of your legacy in the same way? No. Those, I think, because there's so many cooks. Yeah. None of them are mine, really. I don't even recognize a lot of it as from the same world as my comics. It's like the same as when they make toys of my work. It's like it's sort of related, but I didn't make the toy. It's a very different feeling, and I liked having that lack of responsibility, kind of. That I didn't have to stay up at night worrying, did I get every little detail right? Because it's ultimately not on me to figure that out. It must be satisfying in a different way, though, to see all of these people working on something. Oh, it's very strange. Especially on Ghost World, the first one, to see, like, I would write a line in the script that was just mainly like a joke to make Terry laugh when he read it. And then you'd see people responding to that line. They say, in the script, it says it's nighttime and it's raining and it's all this stuff. And it's like, it doesn't matter. I just made that up. It doesn't, you could do whatever you want. Realizing, though, that you write rain and then that's like another like $20,000. It's $20,000, and it's like the crew is like, oh no, we have to get wigs for all the actors. And you've ruined a lot of people's lives. And you realize how biblical the script is, and it took me a while to figure that out, to go like, ooh, I always wanted to put an asterisk, like, doesn't matter, this is just in there to make it sound. A lot of it is that I want the descriptions to sound good, because I was used to writing captions in comics, but the descriptions don't have to read well or sound good. It's all just information. I always loved those in Mad Magazine, the editor's notes that were clearly just jokes in there. Right. Just like, it's just doing that as sort of like a way of kind of apologizing. Yeah. Overall, though, did you enjoy the experience, even though it's kind of not really a part of your life anymore? I enjoyed some of it, and, Are you glad you did it? Oh, yeah, for sure. It was fun, and it definitely opened me up to appreciate comics more, appreciate the sort of the thing I can do with comics that no filmmaker can do. The control. Yeah. You see even people who are real auteur filmmakers who really do everything themselves, they have to make so many compromises, just based on, like, the fact that it might not be sunny the day you're shooting. There's all kinds of things that you have to react to along the way that doing comics you do not. All you have to react to is what's going on in your head at a given time. That's right. You're fighting yourself, but you're not fighting, a prop person who doesn't know what they're doing. That's that's a very different thing.
The comics process is still an enjoyable one for you?
More than ever, yeah. I've gotten to that stage, which I think you need to get to as an older artist, is to just be in it for the love of it, because there's nothing else really that will carry you through. So it's really, I could very happily not publish any of my comics. I could very happily just do them, show them to a few people, and move on with it. It's not about what happens after it's done. It's really about doing it, and it's endlessly compelling.
There you go, an absolute all-time legend. Thanks so much to Dan Clowes for taking the time to do that. If you're a fan of his work, which I am sure if you listen to this podcast you are, you should pre-order his new book, Original Art. That's out next month on Fantagraphics. Thanks so much to him. Thanks to Jack for setting up that conversation. Really, really enjoyed it. Thanks to you, as always, for listening to the program. If you like the show, there are a number of ways to support us. You can rate and review us on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Like us on Facebook. If you have any feedback, it's rolcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Tumblr. That's rolcast.tumblr.com. And that's about all I got for this week, so stick around because we're going to be back just about this time next week with another episode of RIYL.